So as a ski resort community, we welcome all types of tourists, both domestically and internationally. And it's been an interesting experience with COVID-19, mostly because as the numbers were coming out, it did not seem like we had many cases when you compare to Seattle or you compare to New York City. But over the last few weeks, as the data was starting, we were starting to analyze more data, we found that we had actually one of the top cases per capita in the US for our county. And I think, I used to look at this every day, and for the last few weeks, we're in the top 10 of all US counties. It's Summit County, Utah, along with 3 other pretty renowned ski resorts here in the US. So even though our number count right now, case count is at 220, it's a lot for a small community of 40,000. So that's been interesting for us to kind of face. I also lived through SARS in 2003 when I was in Beijing. So that contrast has been interesting. And I've been following this through a lot of my friends who are still in China and expats in China. And so I've been following this since January. And, you know, it literally kind of felt like a tidal wave slowly coming towards us, and finally it hit. So I think because of that, I feel like I personally was a little bit more prepared to make the transition for the kids to online learning, working at home, etc. And we're hunkering down. We're staying at home. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So, Catherine, would you give us a few words, please?
Hi, I'm Catherine, and again, thank you for having me. I live in the Bay Area in San Mateo, California, and I feel somewhat fortunate that we are one of the first states to have us stay in place. I actually, Yi and I know each other from Beijing, but we had a friend who was here who was quarantined in Beijing and then came here to San Francisco and self-quarantined herself for 14 days. And we had her over for dinner, and all she could talk about was how unprepared the US was for this COVID-19. And she was comparing what China did, South Korea did, to what the US was doing. So in a way, her anxiety got me prepared early. I got some extra rice. I got some extra toilet paper. So I think her anxiety actually prepared me to hunker down sooner. And I too actually was in Beijing during the original SARS. And I actually don't remember the anxiety I feel now compared to the anxiety I felt. I didn't feel anxiety back then, not to the extent I do feel now. We were still in the parks. That's how I met EE. We had a picnic in the park, and so we were still all going out. Just, we made sure we were outdoors. But now no one's going anywhere.
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine. So I think I have Kiko. Would you mind giving us a little introduction, please? You need to unmute. There we go.
Hello, everyone.
Good.
I'm Akiko. We live in Canada, and I have 3 kids at home, so it changed the life a lot. It's just interesting to see the different countries, how all those countries respond differently. I've heard news from Japan because I'm from Japan. My parents are still there. They're responding differently to this COVID-19. And here in Canada, where I live, at the beginning, I think the people were panicking, so I rushed to the store, and then grab stuff and then just go home. Right now, it's not many people outside. We're just trying to do self-isolate. And we used to live in Beijing for 3 years, from 2014 till 2017 summer. So it was interesting to see that how China responded at the beginning when this COVID-19 started. So it was interesting to see that each country respond differently. Thank you.
Thanks, Akiko. Alexander, please.
Hi, everyone. My name's Alexander Simon. I live in Flushing, New York, so part of New York City, and I've been here for about 3 years. I'm half Chinese, so I was born in the U.S., but my mom's Chinese, and so I just think this whole situation, as as some of the other speakers have mentioned, has really turned life upside down. It's the isolation. And the other thing that's been hard for me is the all the businesses closing, and not just well, I guess it's the grocery stores. It sounds a little crazy, but I mean, the area I live in is a predominantly Chinese neighborhood, and the COVID situation has impacted all the the international supply chains, and so the grocery stores can't get food anymore, and so they've all shut down. And yeah, I don't really know where my next food is going to come from, even though I have things stocked up for now. So it's been very disruptive and very agitating in terms of just not knowing how things are going to turn out.
Thanks, Alexander.
You're welcome.
Gabe, I think you're in the lower left-hand corner from my screen. Would you mind giving us a little introduction, please?
Sure. My name is Gabe. I'm born and raised in New York, live in New York, but currently in New Jersey because decided to leave New York City. My wife is Michelle. She's on this call as well, and I guess maybe what I'll provide is a little bit of perspective from. Because I haven't heard anybody mention it before. So my background is in risk management, and I work primarily in in banks. And for me, the situation, I sort of have tracked it a little bit since the beginning of the year, and obviously I've heard from some people overseas about the situation over there, because they had sheltered in place, I think starting in January overseas, and so naturally, since it was such a remote location, didn't really think that it would impact us, but it really started to hit home, I think, I guess near January and end of January and the beginning of February, because I remember I went away one weekend with a friend, and he's in the same line of work as I am, and he was texting me saying, "Oh, I might not be able to meet up because I have to." We were meeting up on a Saturday. He's like, "Oh, I have to run some scenarios about the impact of the COVID-19 virus on the financial markets, and I might have to push back our meeting." So it really started to hit home, because I know, at least where I work, they talked about it, but they weren't necessarily as proactive as maybe his institution in taking a look at how this situation might impact the markets, and then it was sort of like a slow moving train wreck because everything, at least in terms of preparedness, people were starting to take a look and monitor the situation at work, and then obviously things progressed fairly dramatically by the end of February, beginning of March, because March has been a fairly brutal month, at least from the financial market perspective. But then I guess personally, it's definitely impacted things quite a bit because one, I had to move out of the city because of the fact that we didn't feel that it would be best for our family to stay in the area where it seemed like there was a rapid progression of people getting sick over there. But I mean, obviously, you don't see it on a day-to-day basis. But then occasionally you hear stories about somebody eventually catching the disease.
Thanks, Dave. I mean, I think it points again to so people have been saying in one way or another is how unprepared the U.S. was. So I'll do. I think I got everyone right. I didn't leave anyone out. But so we're. I want to just give a brief story about one of the reasons that I thought this would be an interesting, group to talk about. Is I moved to Beijing on the 18th of February. It was a planned move. I retired from my position at Columbia in January, and then I had about 6 months ago started thinking about my opportunities, and I decided to move to Beijing. But my principal, and this is in February, mind you. First couple of weeks, thought I was totally insane, as if I was committing suicide. I was, getting on a plane and flying to China, where this horrible virus is coming from. And of course it was I seem prescient now, but it's like I'm living in this bucolic, wonderful city that I love anyway. There's no community transmission. So basically the only cases are those that fly in from New York or Italy. So it's an interesting, take. I'm feeling a little guilty that I'm here and safe while my family and friends and colleagues are, on the front, literally on the front lines. I have a son who's a physician, an orthopedic surgeon, as well, who is working in the emergency room at Columbia Presbyterian in New York City. So it's been redeployed, if you will, because there's no elective treatment of orthopedic problems in the midst of this outbreak. But it's a very, very kind of ironic situation that people keep saying, "How are you?" I said, "I'm fine. I'm worried about you." It's totally fine here. And I put up with surveillance. There's a lot of surveillance, and it's annoying. So I'm going to say something which would be annoying to all of you. It's annoying for me when I go to the restaurant, which, yes, the restaurants that are open here now. I have to sign a form, I have to scan a QR code, I have to have my temperature taken, but I get to go to the restaurant. So it's a big advance. But the thing that kind of like sparked me on this is that I've been in China a lot over the last 20 years. Typically, I was in China 5 or 6 times a year in many, mostly in the big cities, in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Chengdu, and in the big international cities. And I never, ever felt any prejudice or any of being singled out because I'm old white guy, and just always felt totally comfortable. And on this trip, I noticed, when I first got here and I was on the streets, that there were no Western people. I think everyone pretty much fled Beijing, but they didn't realize it was stay here. But and I felt people looking at me differently, and it's a very interesting feeling. And it's already, I think, starting to pass. But in this first month that I was here, I did have that feeling, not from my colleagues and from the people that I work with, from the people in with and none of that, but just on the street. And so I'm kind of like, and I've had some comments from some of my friends who are my Asian friends living in New York, that they've had similar feelings. And so I wonder if anyone has had any of that or felt any of that, or would rather say, no, I haven't. I just would like to get some comments on that.
Sure, David, I'd be happy to start. I kind of want to go back to January when all of this was happening back in China, and the outbreak in Wuhan. And at that time, Park City is a very small community. It is not, even though there are a lot of international visitors, we are not very ethnically diverse in terms of our social fabric. And so there's probably just a handful of Asian American families that are here in Park City. And I still remember, I'm going to tell a story. I was out skate skiing with a bunch of women, and one of those women was a friend from my daughter's school down in Salt Lake City, and she was from Beijing. And she happened to have her sister who lives in Beijing there. And when all of this happened and the other women around heard that she was from Beijing, it was that moment of, like that kind of look around. And that was the first feeling. And I don't think that was in any way, racially motivated as much as it was that person was coming from Beijing. It could have been an expat from Beijing, and they would have been concerned. In general, I'm sure everybody who's on this panel has seen the news about all of the different incidences of harassment or violence towards Asian Americans in the past several months, and it's really disheartening. It's painful, I think, for all of us, and it's just upsetting, and especially, for me personally as a Chinese American, I'm an American-born Chinese, born in the U.S. This is a personal struggle that I've had throughout my life, except for, of course, when I lived in China for 15 years. It's personally, I have not encountered this here in Park City. In fact, when I saw some of these news accounts, and I posted it on my social media, I can't tell you how much there was this outpouring of disgust, and my friends in my community coming out and saying, we're completely against this. This is horrible. It's shameful. I even had an acquaintance here in Park City who I don't know very well, who reached out to me personally, wanted to have a conversation on the phone. And she just said to me, she said, I just want you to know, if you ever encounter something like this, you need to call me. We are all behind you. I mean, that type of feeling from somebody who I'd never met. So that's just kind of a personal story that I've experienced. I do feel, like I said, this has been a bit of a lifelong struggle, the idea of being a minority in America. I feel that I go outside and now I feel a little more self-conscious when I'm outside. And if that person is looking slightly askew to me, at me, I'm like, is that because I'm Asian, or is it, I don't know, they don't like what I'm wearing? Who knows? I'm out in my pajamas. I don't know. It definitely has hit home in my own psyche, every time I go out, even though it has not personally affected me.
I mean, living in New York City, given the diversity of the city, never really individually felt the need to be, I never felt really aware of, I guess, any differences in myself relative to everybody else because, the earth, there's so many people that are different, right? So it wasn't really much, you never really think much about it. And I think definitely now that I'm more attuned to the media, I'm sure that the media has some impact on the way I'm thinking and also on the way other people think, for sure. Obviously it doesn't help that the president had said that this was a Chinese virus, because that definitely, I think, gives people, or people might feel they have a license to speak out more against it, especially if you're Asian, because now somebody authority has made that claim, and I guess sort of stigmatizes it. So at least for myself, one thing I would say is that I have noticed a couple of incidences where I was out on the street. I walk onto the train, and then it is probably just like teenagers being like rude teenagers. They're like, "Oh, Corona!" Like as soon as I walk onto the train. So like obviously that's directed at me because I don't think there was anybody else that was there that they could direct it to. And then there's a couple times where the funny thing is, I just found it kind of amusing because here I am walking through, and it happened more than once. Actually, it happened twice. I was walking through once it was at a bagel shop, and the other time was at a grocery store, and then I'm just going about my business, just like everybody else, buying up some, buying what was left on the groceries, the shelves, and then this guy, like when I walk up next to him, he looks over at me and then he does this. He's like, so like it was so obvious, like how much, I guess there was this innate fear in him. Like I don't know why he did it, but he looked over me and then he just raised up his collar, like he was somehow protecting him. And somebody did that too at a different store. So there's definitely some people that are probably a little bit more sensitive to what's going on.
That's terrible. Here in California, you would think that we are so diverse and we have such a huge Asian population, but since we've been sheltered in place for a long time, I haven't seen many people, but we have an app called Nextdoor, and people post things. And one lady posted up a street sign, and on the back of the street sign said Chinese disease, like they defaced the street sign. So, there are people that will go to such lengths to, say that or write that on something. And I really, when Trump actually did call it the Chinese disease, it really infuriated me because I know he's doing it to create hate. And, another group to discriminate against here in America. So that's something I feel strongly about.
That's certainly, I just, those statements made my blood boil, and to have our Secretary of State repeat it was totally out of control. So there's take moderated prerogative briefly. When I came to China was still having a huge shortage of PPE, of personal protective equipment. And so as half of my bags, in this move I made were filled with masks. So we took, we brought masks and shields to make a tiny little dent, in the need over here. And so now, of course, and that was mid-February, right? We were so not anticipating what was going to happen. And so my company I brought like 1,000 masks over, so my company just sent 10,000 masks back to the States, and we're collecting PPE from donations across China. And we're going to end up with a huge donation. And I think that the kindness of Americans toward Chinese who were suffering in Hubei was palpable, and now the kindness and generosity of the Chinese toward the Americans seems to be, to me, more real than our president saying the Chinese virus. Just a little hopeful statement. Joey, have you had any problems or sensed anything? You're working in Manhattan.
Luckily, I so far I haven't been insulted by anyone, but I cannot guarantee that in the future, with all these pandemic and having all those shops been shutting down, people losing job, it's really hard to say that people are not going to criticize us. But I totally stand opposite to what Trump saying this is a Chinese virus. I think it is totally irresponsible trying to push his responsibility of his late response to this pandemic. I cannot express how angry I am on his reactions. Especially, I work as a data scientist in a hospital, and I witness a lot of my colleagues, even though I don't even know them, I witness the number of employees being infected very quickly on a daily basis. And this is, I don't really think he should push the responsibility on the Chinese side. I think he should take the full responsibility of all these disasters. And I think he should did a better job. So going back to like those reactions to the Asian Americans, I know someone, and David, you know him too, but I'm not going to mention his name. He mentioned that on the Instagram posting that he was insulted about like 6 times in 10 days, and that he lived in Manhattan. He used to work with us. He's now working in HSS. I feel really sorry for him. And I think this is a fact that we have to deal with right now. And I believe we as an Asian American, we have a strong community in America. And what we did so far, as I can tell you, is, for example, we have a WeChat group, a lot of WeChat group in different communities, like Chinese SOS group. We are not allowed to having conversation randomly in this group chat unless you are having a very emergency, getting insulted by others, and people around you, Chinese, will come gather around you and help you to go through those difficult situations. And I think this should be followed by other communities where a lot of Chinese Americans live in. And I think we have to make some movement to protect ourselves rather than just criticizing people, insulting us. We have to make some movement of protecting ourselves. That's my point.
So I haven't maybe I received a dirty look when we were picking up some groceries from a person with their child, and it could have been COVID-19 related. I have a feeling it was, but I just moved on. I thought, okay, maybe he's having a bad day, and I was just in his line of vision. But we live in Chinatown in New York City. We have noticed, just in general, right around Chinese New Year, we live right where the parade is. There was a decent turnout for the parade, but nowhere near how it used to be. And I did hear comments being made by non-Chinese just walking through the parade, just super rude comments about they're spreading the virus and stuff like that. So that was in late January.
For me, my experience with that it started when I started wearing a mask. I started that pretty early when most people weren't wearing masks, and I noticed just the reaction from non-Chinese people, just kind of like Michelle, like you were saying about the dirty looks, like that. And I've also, the one time that I was in an American department store, and two guys were within earshot of me, and just making reference to that Asian-looking guy wearing the mask, and how the Asians think they're better than us because they have masks, and it's none of that helps. It's uncalled for, and that type of energy needs to be directed elsewhere. There's no use in pointing fingers when we can be helping each other instead. I mean, this is a widespread problem affecting everybody, and it needs the efforts of everybody in order to battle it and to succeed. And so I think, I agree with one of the other speakers too, that, we need to support each other in, whenever this happens. We also need to increase awareness of this issue, as we're doing right here. Because if people aren't aware of it, they keep doing what they're doing. And so that's kind of how I feel.
I also agree with Joe Wei. When you said, we need to speak up against it, I don't think we only should be bringing awareness to it. We need to speak up against it. And when it happens, we need a voice. We need a strong voice, and let them know that it's not okay. I mean, I think throughout history, Asian Americans being the model minority, and being somewhat quiet and stepping away from conflict. And I think as Asian Americans, and with our other, Latino Americans, Muslim Americans, back during 9/11, it was a lot of prejudice against Muslim Americans. I think the leadership within the nation was definitely had a strong message about eliminating that versus now, but it really is, again, an experience of a certain minority, and it's about time that we kind of all band together, so not just Chinese Americans and Asian Americans, but we need to get Hispanic Americans, and even just, a lot of educated people who really want to speak out against this, to work together on these messages.
I agree with you, and but we cannot deny that this will be a phenomenon that will last for a period of time, and I'm hoping in this year's presidential elections, the debating will make sure the public view on this, the cause of this pandemic happened in New York, in US. I hope the public will realize the current president should take the majority of the responsibility rather than the Asian American community, because we did nothing wrong. We're wearing masks. We protect ourselves. If we have a fever, or we trying to not spread it to other people's, that's all we can do. And as a leadership, I think he should take he should have took quick response to this pandemic, because everything happened in China was in early January, and at that time US only had 30 from the cruise, 30 infections from the cruise, and none of them are dead, and he just didn't pay attention to it, and comparing this to flu and encouraging us, it will be fine, we will go over it, this coronavirus will disappear in April miraculously, and I don't think this is a thing that should be expressed by president to the public. And also, I today I was watching a video posted by Noah, the Daily Show thing. It was
Trevor Noah, yeah.
Trevor Noah, and he compares the pre-pandemic discussion among those Fox hosts and compare with their post. And I think those hosts should also pay for it. It is, they have a huge responsibility of spreading wrong message to the public. So people are not wearing masks. People are hanging out, disregarding of social distancing, making this pandemic happen. And they should pay for it. I'm a little bit, I mean, by just watching this, I'm super angry, super.
Thanks, Joey. I think that, and it's like for those of us that, because I'm not there, but I'm kind of there by surrogate, because even though I left Columbia Presbyterian, I'm kind of like, I'm still, I have an emeritus appointment there, and I still get all my emails from my department chairman and from all the internal communications. I mean, it's, pardon language, but it's a shit show. It's terrible. And it doesn't need to be as bad as it is, because, we just weren't prepared. And there was no reason we shouldn't have been prepared. We saw, it was like clear. And there were many voices on the academic side, particularly the ID docs and the epidemiologists who totally accurately predicted what was going to happen. And it's just a shame. It couldn't have been prevented, but it could have been ameliorated. It could have been softened. We are who we are. But I do a weekly blog, a WeChat blog, and I'm writing one now on my propaganda, how propaganda against the use of masks affected me and my thinking when I was in the U.S. and before I moved to China. And so when I had to put a mask on when I got on the Air China flight from Tokyo to Beijing. I couldn't fly to Beijing. My flights were canceled, so I had to fly from Japan. And when I put the mask on, and I've been wearing it ever since. I'm still wearing it, even though at this point they've said, the city authorities in Beijing have said you don't have to wear a mask outdoors. But everyone is wearing a mask anyway, so it's like everyone is. But I realized how wrong the U.S. propaganda is, and it's taking them. They're finally getting to the point where they are admitting that that's the case.
David, I'd love to share another, sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I'd love to share another story around mask wearing and also prejudice. Because, well, first of all, I feel like the whole messaging around masks has been completely wrong here in the US as well. And it's actually stigmatized a lot of people who, like Alex has, you've been out there to protect yourself. My brother, he's immunocompromised. He's had a kidney transplant. And he lives in Austin, Texas. He needed to go back to Iowa for a checkup because it's been about 2.5 years since his kidney transplant. And I think it was maybe January, February. And he had masks. And there was this question, should he wear a mask on the plane or should he not? Because if he was going to wear a mask on the plane, being a Chinese man with a mask, there was fear that he would be attacked or harassed on that plane. Actually, I don't think he ended up wearing the mask, hence endangering his life, as given his history. But that just kind of, that's an anecdote where, you know, you're weighing, you know, the discrimination and potential violence versus your own personal health.
Now, it's one of those things where I really do believe that we were misled. And there's a whole new, everyone's probably seen the same online stuff, you know, looking at the difference of the spread and the steepness of the curve in countries that are mask adherent as opposed to countries which are not. And it's hugely different. Of course, there may be other factors too, but obviously, it's very, very interesting. So I'm very comfortable with my mask, and I'll keep it on as long as the rest of the people wear it. So.
Actually, I got a question. You know, given that you're a medical professional and you probably, I guess, it sounds like you have some contacts over in Asia. Like, you know, in the media there are I guess there's, you know, certain people are saying that that there might be some underrepresentation of the severity of the situation in China, so they may have underreported some of the amount of people that have actually contracted the disease. And does that you find any truth to that?
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, I have my feelings are purely personal because I don't have any inside dope on the numbers we have. But I think that I generally accept the numbers that the PRC government's giving us about death. I don't really necessarily accept the numbers about the prevalence or the incidence of the disease, because they suffer from the same issues that we do in the States and that they have in Europe, and that there are so few people tested compared to the size of the outbreak. And they really weren't counting asymptomatic people, you know, so there's I think a lot of people weren't counted. But I think when you look at the stats as they're offered here in China, I mean, I can pull up my WeChat and look at the websites, and I can come up with, you know, day by day, you know, infections and right down to the, you know, the neighborhood, you know, so the reporting is pretty transparent, at least at this point. There may have been some issues in the beginning. And I think that it points to the fact that when China shut down Hubei province and kind of like just threw a bubble over Wuhan and said, you can, too bad, we're not letting you go out no matter how overwhelmed the medical system is. It was, from a societal point of view, from a public health point of view, it was totally the right decision. They did it and enforced it. And social distancing here is not elective. It's like my roommate family is from Beijing. In fact, they kind of originated from one of the little hutong here in the city. And Dan, my roommate, still has a house there. And so just a couple of weeks ago, when things have been loosening up, we decided to go back to the hutong, to go back to that house and pick up a few things for our apartment. And it took us an hour to get into the hutong, because even though he's a property owner, they hadn't seen him recently. So as far as they were concerned, he's a foreigner. So no one is allowed to come in, and much less me, to come into that neighborhood. And so in a city like Beijing, it's neighborhood by neighborhood. And I live in a kind of like expat compound. There's like a bunch of towers and gated community. So there used to be like 6 gates. Now there's like 1, and you have to, you have to have a card that proves that you're a resident there. If you're not a resident, you can't go in. They recently started allowing our housekeeper to come in. They recently started allowing the delivery people to come to the concierge instead of leaving stuff at the gate. but you know, it's still that way. Even though things are starting to open up, the kind of like movement is still controlled. I still cannot travel. I'm desperately in need of I need to get to Guangzhou. We have a deal going down there. I really need to be there, but I can't go because if I go, I have to be in quarantine 2 weeks in Guangzhou, and then I'll be in quarantine 2 weeks when I get back to Beijing. So but that's the way they shut it down. And so I think that some of the media questioning the numbers here, it's kind of like, you know, it's like, well, how could it be so low? And I would say, well, it's so low because they're doing a lot to prevent the spread of the disease.
I want to add one more point upon Dr. Roy's response, because I do like listen to the news this morning saying that the Chinese government might covering the number, underreporting the number that getting infected or death, and I also doubt that too. The number might be bigger. I mean, I'm almost for sure the actual number of Chinese getting infected is going to be way more than 80,000 because not all of them are getting tested. Currently, 300,000 US confirmed cases are being tested, and you don't really know like how many of them are not being tested, has a symptom, or coronavirus positive. You never know about that. But here I want to convey the message is I don't really think the actual number of infections really matter that much. I think what really matters is how the government is reacting to this pandemic, and we can see a clear difference between Chinese government and U.S. government. And I'm not going to like further criticize because you can see clear difference between the reactions, and I think that difference is making a huge difference in number. And I think that's my point, and my point is aligned with Dr. Roy's point.
I just want to add something here too. The one thing that really bothers me and even infuriates me sometimes about American news about China is that it isn't always just about reporting, you know, what is going on in China. The American media always has to spin it in a way that makes China look bad. And I think it's so uncalled for. And, you know, the whole underreporting thing, you know, is, in my mind, is just a way of the media shifting the focus away from the fact that America is unprepared. And that, you know, and you know, it's back to what the president is saying and him not taking responsibility. They're pointing fingers, you know, trying to shift the blame elsewhere, when really we need to be addressing our own deficiencies here. So that's one point. And then the other point that I was thinking of was with what Dr. Roy was saying with the you know, the social ice or the quarantine being, you know, it's not elective in China. And I think that makes all the difference because, I mean, from a public health perspective, that is going to be very effective. Whereas here, you know, unfortunately, we can't enforce that here. And it's devastating to see what the effects are of it here. So anyway, just a couple of thoughts.
Alex, this is Alan. You're absolutely right. The U.S. media can never say a good thing about China. You rarely hear anything good. And, you know, I'm not Chinese, so I don't have a particular bias, but it's ignorance. It's ignorance, and it's not no insight into China and what's going on, what has gone on in China for the last 50 or 100 years. It's sort of a lack of any perspective.
Yeah, it's so sad.
And, you know, this situation makes it worse because of that. And, you know, educated, otherwise so-called reasonable people just have a lot of misconceptions that are prevalent throughout our society. And the media, you know, I am skeptical of the media in any sense. I mean, you have to take the media no matter what with a grain of salt. But when they say stuff about China, you rarely hear anything good. And you know, having lived in China and then coming back to the States, it was really obvious. They had not a clue what's been going on and what is going on, because they speak out of such ignorance and lack of understanding of facts.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
You know, and China just made they sent over 1,000 ventilators, and I could not believe it. You know, on CNN was spinning that in a way to, you know, malign China, and I'm like, are you kidding me? They just gave us 1,000 ventilators, which we need, and yeah.
Well, you know, I think you know, I think it's ignorance, and you know, it's, as a pediatrician, I'm a developmental guy. I mean, we look at kids. I don't know how many of you have kids. Everybody's at a different stage of development, and you know, a lot of people here are at a fairly chronologically less, they're more like 2-year-olds, and they're thinking about China particularly. And we, you know, that's understanding that's helpful, because it means we shouldn't take it personally, you know, if it's something that affects you personally. But that's hard to do. It's hard to not take some of it personally. But I worked in the health department here, and I deal with a fairly highly educated group of people as my colleagues and friends. Even among them, the level of misunderstanding is profound. And so that's one of my missions here, is to at least correct them when they say stupid stuff about China.
That's actually an interesting point, because like at this current time, you know, there's so much misinformation or lack of information and just some plain ignorance, that you sort of don't, if somebody comes up to you and they're you know, say something like anti-Asian, then you don't know necessarily where it's coming from, because is it at this point, like, it could be ignorance, it could be because they, you know, they have a, you know, some pure hatred, or it just could be fear, like at this time it's sort of a mixture of that.
You know, ignorance is for sure. And I think that, you know, things were bad enough in terms of American understanding of China's, you know, political system, culture, everything before Trump. But then now we have the administration under Trump has actively sought to demonize China. So it's more, it's not even passive. It's an active demonization of China, the enemy, like totally bizarre. We all understand why. But it's like that's it's even worse now than it was, you know, than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
I think there's just always been this skepticism around China and its motives, just because fundamentally our government systems, one that's socialist, communist, the other one that's like, we completely are like have a conflict, right, stemming back from the 1950s. And I think even though China has had such great progress and has done so much, lifted so many people out of poverty, you know, over the last 30 years, and done some amazing, great things, I think I think your general American population doesn't understand that. And it's not until, and I've had many friends or colleagues who actually, it's not until they go to China and experience it and come back completely transformed. Because Alex, I think you're right. All of you, the media is not portraying China in a very objective light. I do think that there are some media outlets that are doing a great job, and also being very critical of our own government. New York Times, I love reading the New York Times. I think it's deep seated, and it goes back many generations.
I think all that feeds into how people treat each other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I keep thinking that this virus, and if we're able to beat this virus here in America, it's really the only way we can do it is if we actually care about one another. You know, because we will socially distance and we will shelter at home, and we're doing that for the elderly, the immunocompromised, now even the young, for everybody else. Except, it's a very altruistic type of behavior. But yeah, it's.
Well, the thing I find most disturbing about Americans, as an American, I can do this, I guess, is the arrogance, the assumption that somehow, we're we are the most enlightened group of people in the world, and our failure to be able to learn from anybody else is, I think, a big lesson that we can take away from this whole thing. What I always thought was, having lived in China and having been raised in America, my background is I'm a global nomad, but I basically am American, retired Army colonel. So, I come a long way in my sort of thinking about things, but America has a lot of great things, as you all know, and China can learn a lot from America. But China also has a lot of great things, and we could learn a lot from China. The best of all worlds would be we'd be open enough to do it a two-way exchange here.
I do agree with Dr. Mies. I think you bring up a really good point that I think at this moment, U.S. and China should put down the conflictions and shake hands and embrace each other for collaboration and overcome this disease, this coronavirus altogether. Because previously, like last year, is all about the conversation about trading war between U.S. and America, and there's a lot of conflictions between U.S. and America, and it seems like we're continues this confliction under this big pandemic circumstances, but I don't think that is okay. I think there's a lot of things that U.S. hospitals could learn from Chinese hospitals, because the Chinese government's Chinese hospitals has been successfully treating those coronavirus patients and shortened their lengths of stay in a hospital, making the surviving rate higher than the beginning. And I think those treatment methodology that should be learned by the U.S. hospitals. Here I can provide you some hard data about like the hospitalization ICU rate that I've been dealing with during the past 3 weeks. So let's say 1,000 people getting infected, about 35 of them will end up in ICU, 30 of them will be on vent, and eventually 50 to 70% of those patients on vent will eventually die in a hospital. So that is a very high death rate. And if the US hospital can learn from Chinese hospital of how to wisely using the medications or treating the patient in a more experienced way, that we can prevent patients from using the vent, because vent, once you are on a vent, the likelihood that you're going to survive is much lower than those patients that does not need a vent. So I think in this kind of scenario, there's a lot of things that can be learned from Chinese hospital by US hospital. I think this is saving people's life. People need to put down their arrogance and learn from each other's experiences and save people's life. I think nothing else is much more important than lives. And this is the point that I want to make.
I so agree, Zoe. I think that there's I manage I got invited to help manage a Facebook page that is all intensivists people working in intensive care units across the world. So when it started, the initial go was like 100 people. It now has 27,000 people. I get a couple of hundred emails a day. I'm supposed to okay the post. Every post has to be vetted. And what it is, Joey, it's a grassroots effort to learn from one another. So in other words, since our government is incapable of running the show from the top, the intensivists are trying to run the show from the bottom. So there are Chinese members of this chat group. There are people from Italy, people from the States, people from all over the world, asking questions and making contributions on tricks and strategies, sharing pre-published literature. It's a very, very interesting group. How I got invited to it, I'm not quite sure. They wanted an English-speaking doctor in China. That was my only real qualification. But it's been interesting to watch.
What I've been grateful for is, because our federal government has been quite ineffective, is that state and local governments have really stepped up, and they, put in stay-at-home orders or shut down businesses, just so that instituted social distancing measures even before I think they got guidance from the national government. But I think what we need, and what frustrates me the most is, for those of us who are following these measures, we've been socially distancing, we've been staying at home for the last, 2 or 3 weeks. We actually will be doing this longer because of all of those other communities or states that are not doing this. Like, there's going to be this lag. And so, I'm just curious from the doctors out there, Alan and David, what's your kind of thought on that?
I agree. I agree. In public health, our system of local, state, and federal government really, and being a federalist approach, really doesn't work. You really got to have everybody doing the same thing. Because Americans, even if you're from XYZ state, you're not going to stay in XYZ state. We're all over the place all the time. Yeah. So although there are governors that are doing a good job, if everybody's not doing it, you're right. It's going to take a hell of a lot longer for this whole thing to end. And that's where, a more centralized approach would work for public health. The trouble is, as a society, I heard the latest analogy is we are a very loose society compared to the Asian society, which is a tight society. We are individualists to the extreme, and the Chinese are more interested in the group and the whole. And this is more than political. This is extreme cultural. So I think we are very, to get people to do everything across the country, we can't even get people to wear helmets on motorcycles, much less wear masks. So, we have an extreme form of individualism that is hard to reckon with the principles of public health. Sometimes when you wear a mask, you're not protecting yourself, you're protecting those from you. What I like to say in this situation is you got to assume everyone has it, and you got to assume you have it. And those are the two assumptions that should change our behavior. So that's why you wear a mask, so you protect those that you might happen to come in contact with if you go to the grocery store. It's not protecting you. And so if you assume, but that's really difficult because you're changing your behavior for the good of the whole. And boy, that's anti-American.
I agree with you, Alan, but I also think it is political. I heard this podcast the other day, and some of the governors who are Republican, they are waiting for Trump to say, let's shut down. And they're not shutting down until Trump gives the go-ahead. We still have states that are still open and not sheltering in place.
Well, Arkansas is one of them. And, and I know the health department, and I work with them, and I know how they function with the governor and the politics here. But, yeah, that is political, but it should not be. When it comes to matters of health, we just have a hard time changing our behavior for the good of the group.
I do agree, yeah.
That's our problem. And that does have political ramifications, but I don't think either side of the spectrum has the the truth here, because I think I'm non-political. I don't. That's my own approach, because I've been out of the game so long, and I've never really seen one of the parties. It's the problem is the divisiveness is what we've got to overcome. So somehow we've got to start functioning as a group, even in the United States, which we don't do, and that's part of the political stuff. Big problem.
Yeah.
I think that the timing issue and the lack of coordination nationally has really definitely hurting us. And I point when I'm talking to my friends back in the States, I say, listen, Beijing shut down the 25th of January. That was the imposition of, kind of like shelter in place. And by February, by the end of February, they were already starting to relax certain rules. So I have a view of the Third Ring Road from my office. And the first, 3 weeks I was here, there was no traffic on but like the fourth week I got here, I started seeing traffic, and I started seeing pedestrians, and I started seeing, like basically the really intense part of the shutdown in Beijing was 4 weeks. And like I've shared with you, things are still strict here. I mean, it's not as if it's just opened up. If there are restaurants that are open, I took pictures and posted them on my Facebook not last night, night before last. I had my first drink in a bar since February 15th when I left Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan. So, a couple of the bars in our compound open. So it's already, they're slowly opening the valve. And but the only way they were able to do it so quickly was kind of really stick with this. I agree with Alan. I mean, it's partly, it's probably 50% cultural, but it's 50% that they had strong central leadership. Someone actually made up the rule book and enforced it, and we just don't have that these days.
Can I ask a question? So when they did the shelter in place and quarantining, or I guess shelter in place in China, did they shut down public transportation, and how did they assign essential employees? Because from what I'm reading, our governor has put in place a pause. So it's called the New York pause. When I read it, I'm like, what's the difference between that and shelter in place? Because the essential employees still have to move around and get paid, do work. And so in China, how did they allow essential employees to get around, but at the same time flatten that curve so quickly?
Well, I think, they didn't shut down public transportation for that reason. And when I first got here, I was in the subway a couple of times, and it's just empty. It's like nobody there. And I guess they didn't really have to shut down public transportation because people are so compliant. And the local enforcement really came from, it was intrinsic, it was the people. So in each hutang, there were like volunteers with red armbands, and they were the community committee. And they're the ones who manned the barricades, right? It wasn't police or army. There was no, when I got here, it was in the kind of depths of the restrictions, and there were no police presence, basically, no more than usual. So it was something which was enforced through, I guess, really from the bottom up. It was really the people that did And the hospitals are handled very differently here. They basically closed the hospitals, which I don't think is good. I didn't like that part of the plan at all. So, our company has a lot of cancer patients, and we don't treat, we just consult for the opinions, but and the majority of them get their cancer care at public hospitals in the planet. And the public hospitals basically just stopped. They just stopped. They looked at, there would be a couple of hospitals, singled out to treat COVID-19 cases, and everything else just stopped. It's now, that's opened back up too. My friends who are in Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Shanghai are basically operating normally now. Beijing is still not. Beijing is still, theoretically the hospitals are open for elective care, but it's, I was there, I hurt my knee in an outing with my Gen Z employees. In fact, running down subways there trying to keep up with them, and I tripped and hurt my knee. And it hurt it enough that I actually felt like I had to see a doctor. So the next day I went to the local VA hospital, and I was treated really well, and it was really amazingly cheap. And I wrote a blog about that too. But it was empty. Empty. Like nobody there. And I know people are not getting care. So that's a downside, right? People aren't getting care that they should be getting.
Do you feel there was a natural advantage with timing in China because it all kind of happened around the Chinese New Year holiday when the country itself, everybody was home celebrating and there was less, or do you think that was I'm just curious. Yeah, it's a way.
Yeah, I would like to say an totally opposite point because, as you know, the Spring Festival is one of the most important festivals in China. And at that time, people who work in the other city will travel back. So actually, during this time period, people are moving around. And this is the most dangerous thing, the last thing you want to see when there's a pandemic. So I would say Chinese government is doing a great job.
What I'm saying is not in terms of moving around. I was more saying in terms of locking down. After that movement happened, then they could lock down. Or because it was a period of time. Anyway, that was.
Well, from my wife's perspective and her family, the timing of Chinese New Year, it kind of came right at the beginning of, or soon after the beginning. So yeah, you're right, Joey, that's a dangerous time. And I don't know how it affected the travel in China. I don't know the answer to that question. Did that really affect travel in China? But I know my wife's family, they were all back in the countryside, and they stayed there until just the other week when they went back to the city. So once they got there and they didn't pass it around, and people in the countryside are pretty self-reliant and can do without a lot of stuff that we're all used to. So for them, I think it was good that they got out of the congestion of the city. But I don't know what effect there should be some statistics available on what effect the virus had on the travel, because they keep those numbers pretty accurately. It'd be interesting to see what effect it had last year compared to this year and previous years.
I think that there was the thing that I think Joey's talking about is that the virus is there since November, right? That's actually when this mutation hit humans. And so the fact that thousands, tens of thousands of people left Hubei and Wuhan to go to their ancestral homes contributed to the spread of the disease.
That's right.
But then the fact that everyone was kind of like home and hunkered down made it somewhat easier to impose the don't move kind of order. I mean, there's still people. I mean, I have a couple of graduate students that still are out in the countryside somewhere that they haven't reopened their school. the Beijing public schools have opened, but not the university. So they look at the university as somehow being more dangerous. And probably the reason being the Beijing schools are for local Beijing children. Tsinghua, Beida, Capital University, they're for students from all over the country. And so there's a greater danger when you bring them back together. So they haven't been opened yet. But these are thoughtful things that the Chinese government's doing that I just don't have any faith that our U.S. government will be able to accomplish. So I just think it's, So listen, I want to thank everyone for being, here and having this conversation. My thoughts are with one and all of you for having to put up with the shutdown and the economic loss. I was listening to what King Tai is going through. I mean, I can't imagine, having your business just cut out from under you. And I just would say that all of us can get through it. And I living in Beijing now, I can at least point to my American friends and say, see, it does end. There's we set through it. We got we flattened the curve, and now we're starting to have more freedom again. And the office towers are now populated again, and businesses are open. It will happen. So, anyway, so thank you, everyone, and have a good night, good day, and don't be surprised if we call on you again for another webinar. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.